Hi, everyone. My name's Luke Evans. I'm here today to talk to you about PowerShell Core, PowerShell 7 as part of the Scottish Summit. Before I really get into the actual deck, I'd like to take a brief moment to give a big shout out to all of our sponsors for the Scottish Summit. Without kind of these great communities providing, or great companies, I should say, providing sponsorship, events like Scottish Summit wouldn't be able to happen. What I'd say is please take a brief moment, look over the sponsors. If you're interested at all at what they do, please reach out to them. And, without being biased, you obviously want to speak to Agilicis. But I make light of the situation. But again, big thanks to our sponsors on this one. What I'm here today to talk to you about very briefly is kind of what is Windows PowerShell versus kind of PowerShell 7 or PowerShell as it's known, and why should it be important to me? How do we get started with PowerShell 7? What are some of the key challenges and differences you might experience when working basically with the Windows PowerShell versus PowerShell 7? And kind of how do we want to move, or how would I suggest you kind of transition your existing solutions, existing code base over from Windows PowerShell or existing PowerShell into PowerShell 7? Now, before I really get into it, I would say there's a whole bunch of different terms and technologies out there. Normally, I like to have interactive sessions and people talk with me. But unfortunately, today I'm kind of recording, so I'm going to have to try to think of some of the questions you might ask on the way. And I'm hopeful that I have them covered. But if not, there'll be a way to reach out to me afterwards. Now, first and foremost, I wanted to talk about myself briefly. Who I am, what I do, and kind of some background around me, around PowerShell, to kind of help hopefully build up some of my credibility. Now, I am coming at this from kind of a collaboration background. So I've been about, I would say, 15 years in Microsoft collaborative technologies. I really have basically grown up in the SharePoint team is where I started. And I actually did my first 6 years in Microsoft. Since then, I've been working as a consultant / architect at a number of different places, and I've been working from a broad range of clients, from anywhere to a couple hundred to 100,000 when I was at Microsoft. Now, that being said, I have kind of broadened my role from just collaboration. I'm mainly focused now, or some of my key interests, I would say, are more around the infrastructure that supports collaboration. So the wider 365 piece, the kind of identity and security pieces around that, and a bit of Azure and how it can help us in terms of automation, and also kind of helping joining the dots together when working in collaborative technologies. I think in terms of my background for PowerShell, I think I've been working with kind of the original V2 of PowerShell, or V1, I can't quite remember which one it was, but since around 2008. And I was actually working on this with basically SharePoint 2007 back in the day. It was great to actually be able to work with the object model without having to delve straight into C#, and it was proved a very useful tool. Since then, I've been trying to basically incorporate this more and more, and I don't know how many lines of code I've written at this point now. As part of that transition, I have been making the leap from kind of Windows PowerShell, which I'll talk to you about in a bit, and basically into the PowerShell Core or PowerShell 7 space for maybe the last year, and I've been trying to up that since. Now, the way I like to approach my sessions really is kind of the who, what, why, when, where, and I think for me, the who is probably the first one, and we spoke a bit about myself, so I like to kind of also build upon, who do I think this session's for? And I think, this isn't going to be most deeply technical. This is kind of, people that have some experience with PowerShell. You kind of understand what you can do with it. And I think the basis of this and the modules that I talk about briefly towards the end are more around 365 and kind of the whole supporting infrastructure around that. So it's good to kind of have an understanding of the Microsoft 365 admin centers and some of the modules you might use for automation. I think, look, this session probably isn't going to be for you if you're a DevOps, or automation superstar. If you already know, the difference between Windows PowerShell, PowerShell Core, PowerShell 7, then this might not be for you, is what I would say. I think the final piece is around, you want to learn a bit more about PowerShell Core, PowerShell 7, and how it can help you automate your kind of day-to-day life. And I think that's kind of where I'm pitching this session to. that's kind of the who. I think let's talk about the what really, and that's kind of PowerShell. So I think for me, the first one is kind of, and you'll have to ignore the cheesy title here, but it's kind of a bit of history around PowerShell. So kind of every version of kind of Microsoft Windows that's been released from even since DOS has included kind of a command line interface tool. It's also known as a shell, kind of a more Unix take on it. But the command prompt has had kind of a mixture of built-in commandlets and the ability to call executables. So kind of an example here is, say, you can use the dir basically in command to basically list, what's in a directory, and call in an external executable, something like ipconfig. So call in an external executable while you're in the command line. Now, the shell or kind of command has included kind of a variety of different ways of scripting things out, but the primary one that people are most familiar with is batch, which kind of used for, I would say, running a series of tasks together, but it's nothing very complicated. Well, certainly in my experience in working with batch, I've never done anything too fancy. I think the other key thing here, and this is going to be very, very prevalent later, is that the outputs from these commands is in a string format. There's not really a way of working with this in any other format than strings. Now, before I delve into kind of the multiple scripting languages that are introduced, we'll talk a bit about the different command line interfaces that have existed in Windows. Originally, when MS-DOS and kind of Windows 95, 98 came out, we had basically command.com, and the craziest thing was this is initially released in the year 1980. So this blows my mind because it's older than me, and it was released 41 years ago. The next up, and I'm sure people are familiar with this one, but we have command.exe, and this came in Windows 98. It was, or actually, yeah, it came in, actually, we'll scrap that part. It wasn't, it's basically in Windows 98, Windows NT, and later. It was basically released in December 1987, which again is a whopping 33 years ago. And I think, the ability to use command today, in this day and age, still blows my mind considering how old it is. And I think, surely there's got to be something better. And I'm hopeful that, PowerShell is that something better. In my experience, it certainly is. It's leagues and streets above kind of command, but I'll talk a bit more about kind of why that is in a bit. I think on top of that, when Windows 98, Windows NT, and later came out, Microsoft obviously recognized there was a gap in terms of scripting languages, and they kind of introduced a whole bunch of different languages throughout that time. We had WMI, VBScript, JScript, and I think these offered a lot more functionality than the manipulation of strings, for example, in command. And I think with each language that was released, or each additional language that was released for scripting within Windows, it offers a bunch of additional problems. And the additional problems probably were that you had, each language had its own separate capabilities, its own format, and, each language had its own basically different syntax. It had a different development and command line environment. And this meant that it was quite fragmented in terms of, the different choices that were available to you. And kind of the learning it all took quite a bit of time and knowledge. Now, certainly it is something that was before my time. I wasn't clued up in these languages, and thankfully, when I look back at the code, I think thankfully I wasn't. But let's go to the next one, which is kind of more about PowerShell. So PowerShell was basically developed as codename Monad from 2002 to 2006. It provides an environment for live commands and creating rich sequences. Now, that's all well and good. That's kind of a bit of a buzzword, but what does that really mean, and where does the value actually exist? And I think for me, the real value is it sits on top of the .NET framework. Now, the .NET framework is kind of a core foundational element of Windows. It means that as PowerShell is built on .NET, pretty much everything in Windows is exposed through the .NET framework. And as PowerShell is built on that, it means you can kind of make use of pretty much any of the .NET functionality, which is simply fantastic in my humble opinion. On top of that, the real difference and the real, as well, the key difference as well as .NET Framework would most likely be that when I talked about string manipulation a minute ago, PowerShell is not driven by the manipulation of strings. So what do I mean by that? I mean PowerShell is an object-oriented language, and shell, and kind of, again, what do I mean by objects? If we break it down a bit, objects are just a representation of something. They're a collection of kind of properties and actions to use them. So they're called methods, the actions to use them. I think these objects allow a much greater level of functionality than just manipulating strings. So manipulating strings is all well and good, but you'll have to be kind of a regex wizard or god to kind of get the same level of functionality, if it all possible, is what I would say. I think each object in PowerShell has kind of a schema or a blueprint. These are called types. I think a common example that I like to use is kind of a car. We can have and the car object doesn't actually exist in PowerShell, before you ask. It's more just about kind of what is an easy way to represent what an object might look like. And I think for me, the properties of a car might be the type of car it is. So it could be an internal combustion engine, or it could be an electric. We can have color is another property. So it could be red, white, blue, silver, black, gold. These are all different kind of properties of that car. Another interesting property you could have is a manufacturer, and you could have Ford, Tesla, Kia. Now with these properties, it makes it very easy to kind of start sorting and filtering these objects, as you could start saying, show me all the cars that are electric and made by Ford that have a color of white, for example. And with text kind of manipulation, regex, it's just not going to be possible. And that, I think, the two elements of that is really what gives PowerShell its strength. And that's going to be that it's built on the .NET framework, and it's object orientated. It is the real two driving factors that have really helped me. I think also on the objects piece is the methods. So what we can do with these objects, and kind of for the car analogy in this instance, the methods might be the kind of start the engine, stop the engine, steer left, steer right, turn the heating on. These are things that you could do with that object, is the important thing. I think one of the other key things that we talk about, and it helps trying to make easy, is the common syntax of using kind of PowerShell. And I think PowerShell kind of uses a verb-noun pair for the names of commandlets and their derived .NET classes. So what does this actually mean? It kind of gets easier once you start looking at the commands, but the verb part of the name identifies the action the commandlet performs, and the noun part of the name identifies the entity on which the action is performed. So for example, an easy one for me that I always think of is get process. So you want to grab all the processes running on a system, and the idea is that it follows all the PowerShell commandlets should follow this common syntax. And the idea is the least cognitive distance to basically try to get to that command. So most of the time when you're working with PowerShell, you can kind of guess what it is that you're actually going to use in terms of a command. So if you're working in, MS Teams and using PowerShell there, if I want to get all the channels, I would probably say get channel. And what do you know? That actually is the command. So it does make life easier in terms of working with PowerShell, in terms of understanding, what do the commandlets look like and how are they structured. So following on my little history line here, which I quite like, I think, look, PowerShell was released in 2006. And the important thing here, and it still blows my mind, it was actually released on XP. It was also released on Vista in 2008 and later. And this PowerShell has gone from basic version 1 to 5.1 today, which is what you see out there in the wild. Now, the key thing here that you'll see is that it's kind of tied intrinsically to kind of the Windows operating system. Now, the next one, following on from my timeline on here, is that PowerShell was well received, and for me certainly it was. But the key thing here was really limited to Windows in terms of where you could use this. It's not to say that you couldn't basically make calls via APIs onto other systems that are not on Windows. But if I wanted to use PowerShell, I was strictly limited to kind of working on Windows. I think the key thing, and again, this is my take on it, I haven't got any empirical evidence to back this up, but certainly my feel for the way that IT has gone, is that, since the launch of PowerShell, organizations' technology composition has kind of altered quite drastically. And I think the diagram on the left kind of helps represent this. And I think what I would say is that, in the modern organization, you'll have hardware and software from different vendors. It's not typically that you have one single platform throughout the whole of the organization across all your hardware and software vendors. In fact, I would struggle to find or name an organization that might have that. I think people are no longer tied to an on-premise network. We make use of kind of multiple clouds as part of the work that I do. And I think the key thing there is that, you're not just working in the Microsoft space anymore. So certainly from me and my home use, I make use of AWS, I make use of G-Cloud, and I make use of Azure. So I myself am kind of a multi-cloud kind of person already, as well as the kind of hybrid and on-premise infrastructure that I have. On top of that, again, it might be that we use multiple clouds. We have a variety of hardware devices, like I called out earlier, but the key one for me is kind of client end user estate. So what we're talking about here is, what are the devices people use to consume and access these cloud, hybrid, or on-premise services that we're using. And that can be a multitude of things. Macs are very prevalent in this day and age. We've got Windows, of course, and on top of that, you have kind of Unix, which is growing stronger and stronger each day. But I think that pretty much is twofold. The rise in Linux or Unix I would say, is kind of the hosting in Azure is one of my understandings that help drive kind of the case for PowerShell Core. I think the other one would probably be the mobile devices that we use to access these technologies. So Android is the most prevalent mobile OS out there. And on top of that, you have iPhone. So it's a very mixed environment. It's probably the best way and easiest way of putting it, is that we have, the modern organization is not tied to any single platform. And I think this is where PowerShell was starting to fall behind, that you'd have to, if you wanted to use it, you were basically constrained to using a Windows system. And I think Microsoft recognized this, and thankfully they kind of recognized the need for something. As part of, I think, 2016, they started driving towards open source. And basically, this is where PowerShell Core came along. And the key thing was that it was originally part of Nano Server. So like I was saying, it runs across Windows, Linux, and macOS as the three things that it launched with. I think the other cool thing, certainly about PowerShell Core, was, like I said prior to this, that kind of Microsoft had a real emphasis, a real focus on basically open source, and PowerShell was kind of the first version of PowerShell PowerShell Core, I should say, was the first version of PowerShell that was released with kind of an open source license. And what this meant was that basically for the first time you could actually contribute and actively upload changes, suggestions to PowerShell, which in my humble opinion is awesome. It is a great direction to take. I feel like it really helps give kind of some buy-in from kind of people that aren't Windows, traditional Linux users, that they're much more kind of open source focused. I think one of the other big changes here that came with this in terms of the launch of PowerShell Core was that the original PowerShell, so that the PowerShell up to 5.1 has been renamed to Windows PowerShell. I think one of the key challenges kind of in PowerShell Core was that basically the compatibility issues that kind of were introduced. And I'll pull up kind of the date line, or the history line just to the right here. But one of the key challenges with PowerShell Core, or PowerShell Core 6.0, was the compatibility issues. Now, one of the key things that they had, I think they had like a third of the commandlets. And one of the key reasons probably here is that you're moving from a world where you have Windows-specific commandlets, and you're moving to a world where you have basically commandlets that are standard across Windows, Unix, and macOS is the key. Now, what we got was PowerShell Core went to version 6.2 and is the available version of PowerShell Core. The next one we've got, and this is kind of, we're getting to very close to where we are today, and basically we had a major update to PowerShell Core with the underlying .NET Core 2.x basically being bumped up to .NET Core 3.1, and this kind of get us to where we are today, which is PowerShell 7. Now, the first iteration was released on March the 4th, 2020. And basically the really nice thing was that they basically added additional compatibility layers behind the scenes to basically allow for kind of seamless operation of Windows PowerShell commandlets. So things that were basically traditionally based on Windows PowerShell. Now, What it actually does behind the scenes is it uses implicit remoting to create kind of local aliases for the source commands. So what that actually means behind the scenes is that it's basically loading up a separate session of old school Windows PowerShell 5.1, and you can basically, it uses that to basically enable that compatibility layer. I think after that, we have moved to 7.1, and 7.1 was really a milestone for me. And this is one of the reasons that I would say, now is the right time to move. And the reason I say that is because PowerShell 7.1 is actually built on .NET 5. Now, .NET 5 is an interesting naming one, but the key thing here is that .NET 5 used to be .NET Core. Now, you have the original .NET, which is ended at .NET 4.82, I think, but .NET Core has now been renamed to .NET 5. So Microsoft are at a point where they feel like the .NET framework or .NET Core has reached a feature parity with the original .NET framework, and .NET Core has now been renamed to .NET 5, and .NET 5 is basically under the hood of PowerShell 7.1 is the key, and that was released not too long ago. It was actually November the 11th, 2020. So we're catching up quite quickly at this point, and I feel like we're at a point now with that kind of underlying .NET 5 base that this is probably the right time to get on board with it. The reason being is that the compatibility, I think the stated goals from Microsoft were about 85-90% of compatibility of kind of the original PowerShell. So you're really not far off, as opposed to the days of PowerShell Core 6.0, where it's kind of 30%. I think that's a very brief overview of kind of what PowerShell is, how we got there. I think what we want to start looking at now is kind of the breakdown of kind of what are the differences between them, kind of what are my key tips and tricks about transitioning from one to the other. Let's kind of start with kind of Windows PowerShell versus PowerShell 7. Now, the other thing I would note before I get into this one really is kind of the naming conventions around PowerShell and kind of what we got now. So the original PowerShell is now called Windows PowerShell. You have PowerShell Core, which is basically 6.1, 6.2. Then we also have kind of PowerShell is the new name for PowerShell 7, or you can just call it PowerShell 7. So I like PowerShell 7 because it kind of helps with the naming convention and trying to understand exactly what I'm talking about. Otherwise, you just end up with PowerShell, and it can get quite confusing quite quickly. I think when we look at the trade-offs between Windows PowerShell and PowerShell 7, this little table I drew up to try to help us kind of understand what are the key differences. I think one of the key ones for me is, we've got Windows PowerShell is version 1 to basically 5.1, and that's what kind of where the train stops on that. PowerShell Core is the future of kind of all the innovation in PowerShell, and kind of we can already see that in the feature set that's being released, but I'll come to that a bit later. I think at the moment PowerShell Core is gone up to, or PowerShell 7, I should say, is gone to 7.1.2, I think is the latest release, and 7.2 is currently in preview. I think, again, calling back to that .NET Core or .NET 5, the difference between the two is that Windows PowerShell is basically limited to Windows only, and you've got basically PowerShell 7, which is multi-platform, and it can be run on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Docker. It's kind of ubiquitous, I would say. It is fairly everywhere is the nice thing. So I really like that. I think it makes it easy because you have that kind of unified management across whatever technology you're using if you choose to kind of pursue the PowerShell route. Again, we have basically the difference between .NET Framework and .NET Core, or .NET 5 as it's known. And I think the other key thing here on this slide that I really wanted to call out really is kind of the kind of update policy between them. And this is really the one that should hopefully, make the case for you guys to think about moving. I think for me is, 5.1 or your traditional Windows PowerShell is kind of critical bug fixes and security updates only at this point, whereas PowerShell 7 is receiving all features being introduced, bug fixes, and the like. It's basically this is where everything's going to happen for PowerShell. I think why should you transition to PowerShell 7? And this is really just following up on that previous slide and kind of just leading into some of the other advantages that I would kind of say, why should you move? I think one of the key things is that it's kind of no harm, no foul. You can run this side by side. So you can run PowerShell 7 side by side by Windows PowerShell. It's completely separate is the nice thing. So you guys can make that transition in your own time is the important thing. But it has a separate installation path, separate executable name. It basically has a separate module folder. It basically separate profiles. So your existing Windows PowerShell profile won't interfere with your PowerShell 7. We basically have separate event logs. It's quite nicely segregated is the key point I'm trying to make here. The thing is, you can pick this up, you can use it for a period of time, you can test it out, and it's not going to affect your Windows kind of PowerShell as it stands at the moment. I think we have that improved compatibility layer behind the scenes, and we also have basically the .NET 5 release. And what this actually means is that the compatibility is pretty much there, is what I would say. I think previously, PowerShell Core, 6.0, could have been quite a struggle if you're picking it up and trying to get it working at the beginning. Certainly, I struggled, and I feel like the compatibility now is much, much closer. And I'll talk through some of the modules I use a bit later and kind of where they're at. But the key thing to me is that you have that improved compatibility layer behind the scenes to fall back on with kind of the implicit remoting and separate 5.1 sessions in the background if needed. I think the cool thing that we're getting is all the new features that we're getting are basically coming along in PowerShell 7. They're not landing in 5.1. And some of the real interesting things that are coming down the pipeline is basically you're going to have PowerShell Get 3.0. So they're moving away the dependency of the package manager or package management module and turning it into, I think, a NuGet based provider. I think the other thing there is we have a whole bunch of new ternary operators and also additional features. So one of my favorites is the for each object parallel. And that's why I put it on here. And basically that runs each of these objects in parallel as opposed to a loop. So if you guys are familiar with PowerShell, it's basically the difference between kind of what would I say, serial versus parallel is probably the easiest way for me to describe it in my mind. And each of those separate kind of parallel ones is operating in its own run space. Now, what this actually translates to is it can lead to a great increase in performance. Again, .NET Core was built with a lightweight kind of ideal in mind to help with kind of the performance, and we can see up to a 73% speed improvements between basically Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core. And that was a quick test I did with Group Object, for example, because I know I've kind of cheated somewhat. I know there was a great deal of performance increase in Group Object, so I used that as kind of the baseline. But you can see, up to 73% speed increase. It speaks for itself as the important thing. The next point I wanted to talk about was SSH-based remoting. Now, previously we had kind of Windows PowerShell remoting, but again, that was kind of constrained more to Windows systems was the primary target for those. With SSH, it's kind of cross-platform again. And certainly for people that use Linux on a day-to-day basis, you're probably very familiar with kind of SSH. So SSH, another key reason that I would probably look to transition over, especially if you're working with a multitude of systems out there. We can basically use SSH-based remoting as opposed to kind of WinRM remoting. The next one up is cross-platform interoperability. Again, that's kind of off the back of the SSH one. But what we're really talking about here is the ability to kind of, it doesn't really matter where you're working. The idea is that you can still use the same code across your different systems to basically, automate and manage things at scale. I think one of the key things here in terms of why I should transition to PowerShell 7 is the support for Docker containers. Now, Docker is a software platform for building applications based on containers. These are kind of small and lightweight execution environments. The containers are isolated from one another, and they bundle their own software, libraries, and configuration files. What this actually means in practice is that you have kind of the best way that I like to think of it is kind of a small virtualized application that we can tear up and tear down in kind of very rapid fashion. Again, we can use basically a PowerShell Docker container to rapidly spin up a version of PowerShell that we wanted to work with. So you don't have to install the actual binaries onto your system. You could just spin up a container and utilize that if you want. I think the next one, and this is a real key one for people that are getting into it, is that you have an improved editing experience with Visual Studio Code. Now, again, like I showed on the last slide, Windows PowerShell versus kind of PowerShell Core, PowerShell 7, is that any future any basically feature enhancements are only going into basically PowerShell Core, PowerShell 7. What that actually means for the editors or editing experience is somewhat the same. You have basically the integrated scripting environment, or the ISE, in Windows. It's built in at the moment. It's rock solid, but the key is that's not going to get, again, that's kind of on bug and critical fixes only. You're not going to get any feature improvements there. Visual Studio Code, again, is the future, and it's really what you should be using. I think VS Code is the #1 development kind of editor in the world today. I think the great thing to help you kind of try and transition from Windows PowerShell to PowerShell 7, if you're very familiar with the ISE, the PowerShell extension in VS Code basically has support to make it seem just like the ISE. So they have an ISE compatibility mode in the PowerShell extension for Visual Studio Code. And this gives it the kind of look and feel. It works in the same way that ISE does. So it really helps you kind of make that transition easier from, a development. So if you're working and writing, code, it's a nice, easy way from transitioning to one to the other. Again, ISE is Windows only. It only supports Windows PowerShell. It doesn't support any PowerShell Core. So yeah, the case for me on that one is very cut and dry. It's very simple. You should be using Visual Studio Code. Not only, I don't want to bang the drum too much, but not only, ISE is focused on PowerShell. That's kind of it. Yeah. Once you start automating, once you start delving further into kind of the code, you might want to dip your toes into different languages, and that's where Visual Studio Code is really going to come into its own. I think it has that extensibility to the product. You can add in different extensions, and at that point you can work with a multitude of languages. I think the other key thing is that PowerShell 7, not PowerShell 7.1, but PowerShell 7 basically follows the .NET kind of support lifecycle, and PowerShell 7 is an LTS, or a long-term servicing release, and that means it will be supported for 3 years. Is the important thing here. Okay, well, this one's an easy one for me, but I've still got to convince you guys, is what I would say. And I think the question here is, when should I make that move? When should I kind of transition from one to the other? And I think with 7.1 and the underlying .NET 5, now is the best time to transition. I think with that stated goals from Microsoft of 85-90% compatibility out of the box, we are kind of at a point that it should be. I will caveat it should be fairly seamless, but I will give you kind of the things to watch out for in a bit. I think I would be looking to make every effort possible at this point in time to make PowerShell 7 as your primary tool. I think we can also supplement this, and the two things that I would probably do, like I called out previously, is that you probably want to make use of VS Code to do the development, and you can also use the ISE mode if you kind of feel less comfortable transitioning to VS Code. I would recommend ISE mode and another extension called Shell Launcher, which basically allows you to quite easily control if you're using Windows PowerShell versus PowerShell 7 and which shell you want to use and launch with. Again, I don't want to keep going on and on about this one, but I feel like it's an important one that you're going to be missing out on any future innovation of PowerShell. So you want to make sure that you are basically, you want to use the latest and greatest. You want those latest features. There's a whole heap of things coming down the pipeline that you probably want to make use of. I know certainly for me, the secrets management one that's coming down the line is going to be a key module that I want to make use of. And that's going to be kind of Windows PowerShell. It's not going to be Windows PowerShell, sorry. I think the other key thing around making this move is that, again, we can kind of use these things side by side. There's nothing stopping you from running them both on your system today. They're designed to be kind of separate, and they're not looking to interfere with each other. So again, this helps build kind of quite a compelling case from my side as to why wouldn't you try this? Why wouldn't you get it going with it today? Okay, great, Luke. Thanks for the pitch. I'd love to move to kind of PowerShell 7. How do I get there? So the good news is it's very easy to get going. And I think there's a multitude of different ways that we can kind of get PowerShell on our system. Now, PowerShell 7, if you're on Windows, there's a few different ways of getting it. You can use a package manager like Chocolatey or Winget. Winget's built out of the box, but Chocolatey is the package manager of my choice, and that allows you to install things via command line. And basically, if you're from a Unix or a MacOS kind of background, you'll probably understand the whole concept of package management, and it makes things very easy very easy to install. It's repeatable, and it's easy to manage, I would say. On top of that, we have the kind of traditional install interface, which is kind of, you can install via zip, exe, MSI, all direct download. You can go to the GitHub repository and pull the releases and install them. I think the real interesting one for 7.1, though, was that this is the first version of kind of PowerShell that has landed in the Microsoft Store. So I used to use Chocolatey, but because Microsoft Store will automatically update it for me, I've kind of moved across to the Microsoft Store edition for my own uses. The other ones, so we got macOS. Again, we can install via the Homebrew package manager, and we can get up and running with PowerShell 7 quite easily that way, or you can go install the package manually from direct download. Unix or Linux, it really depends on kind of which distribution you're in, but most of them, so Ubuntu, I think Fedora, Red Hat, they all have them in the package managers, so you can just go install them from there. The really cool thing, when I was setting up an Ubuntu box the other day, you can actually install PowerShell from the actual server setup screen, which is, again, pretty awesome to me, that it's ready to rock and roll from the get-go. The other one, of course, is you can run PowerShell in Docker in a container, like I mentioned a minute ago. You could basically just spin up a little container that has basically PowerShell running in it. Once you're there, how do I install, or how do I keep this thing up to date? I think one of the other nice features that kind of PowerShell 7 has brought to it is that you're going to get kind of a notification now that, you know, a new version of PowerShell is out there. So in the bottom right, you can see what this would look like, and it's basically letting you know this. I don't think any other version of PowerShell's come with this, but it's going to basically let you know now that there's a new version out there. I think longer term, with PowerShell basically get 3.0 is coming out, the upgrade process is likely to be changed a bit when moving forward. But for the time being, I would strongly recommend basically the Microsoft Store or a package manager approach to basically make your life simple and have a hassle-free kind of upgrade process between the different versions. The next one is an interesting one, and this is kind of with the collaboration focus and what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think for me, what are some of the key modules that I've used or used to use, and what is their kind of real-time, or what would I say, what is their PowerShell 7 equivalent? You know, what works for me? And I think, you know, maybe a couple of years ago, I was using MS Online, but now you can make use of Azure AD and Microsoft Graph. So typically that module is around kind of manipulation of users. And this is the kind of what I'd use back then. I would strongly recommend transitioning to Azure AD and Microsoft Graph. And I think what you'll find is a lot of these, again, are in the similar state to kind of Windows PowerShell versus PowerShell 7, in the fact that a number of these have stopped development on the modules on the left, and they're basically putting all their efforts into the module on the right. I think Exchange Online, this was more about you know, working with mailboxes in Exchange Online, and what I would suggest is you can make use of the Exchange Online PowerShell version 2. And this is again, the ones here all work with PowerShell 7, so you can get cracking with them. The big one, and this is the one that held me back for forever and a day, was that I am a massive fan of the patterns and practices, basically PowerShell module, and I was waiting forever and a day for basically the PowerShell Core or PowerShell 7 equivalent to come along. Thankfully, that's here now, and we have pnp.powershell. Is one of my favorite modules out there. There's over 500 open source commandlets to basically get going with Microsoft Teams, I think Flow or Power Automate, SharePoint, and also some elements of Azure AD. It's simply fantastic. I can't give enough credit to these guys that have done this, and I would, you know, that would be my number one go-to module if you're working with Microsoft 365. The next one is kind of a cheat, which is Microsoft Teams, and that's kind of for Microsoft Teams, Skype for Business. You know, the nice thing is the module is ready to rock and roll already with kind of PowerShell 7. There's nothing you really have to do with that one. SharePoint Online, so this is kind of the Microsoft released one. I would, again, transition to PnP PowerShell for this. Azure RM, so that's the resource manager kind of Azure module. You should transition across to the multi-platform AZ module. And Active Directory, I was surprised to learn they seem to suggest it's good to go is the one. So that was the one I was worried about, but I did some digging the day, and they seem to suggest that Active Directory is here and now and ready to go. Now, to be honest, I don't use the Active Directory module that much anymore because I'm typically interacting with Azure AD, but for some of you guys on-prem, I believe it should be there as well. These are kind of my top modules that I use on a day-to-day basis. I think they're the real key piece of functionality I'm working with. And, you know, I think the key message here is that there shouldn't be anything in terms of a module compatibility issue that should really hold you back if you're working with kind of Microsoft 365 services. It should be in a state that you can interact with pretty much most elements in there, either through Exchange, Azure AD, Microsoft Graph, PnP PowerShell, Microsoft Teams, or AZ. Most of the bases are covered at this point. So again, another feather in the cap of kind of PowerShell 7. I feel like the compatibility issues that came with 6.0 are widely addressed. I think one of the good ones is, how on earth do I actually understand whether a module is kind of compatible or not? And I think what I would say is relatively straightforward to kind of get checking a module compatibility. So on your machine, you can quite easily just type get-module and list available. And what you'll see is there's a PS edition column, and this basically will tell you what versions that this module is compatible with. And you can see Core Desk and Core Desk are the two. So Core is PowerShell 7 or PowerShell Core, and Desk is kind of Windows PowerShell. If you use both, it's compatible with both. But the main one that you're looking for to avoid are basic PS editions of Desk only is the key. And I think we can quite easily check the module compatibility that way. I think I'm coming to the end of my slides. I think what I wanted to talk about was the kind of the key takeaways around this session, and what I'd recommend kind of some go-tos are. And for me, the real key takeaway here is I don't feel like there's anything really stopping you from getting, downloading and using PowerShell 7.1 today. It would be the if you could take one thing away, that would be the key one. I think another one is, look, you probably want to get VS Code up and running if you're doing any sort of PowerShell projects, even if you are still working in Windows PowerShell. Again, I would strongly recommend the use of VS Code. There's a number of different improvements that have been integrated into the PowerShell kind of extension. And on top of that, as well as using VS Code, I would probably look to transition. Instead of running the PowerShell shell, I would probably look to use the Windows terminal, which again is kind of a multi-shell launcher. So it has SSH, it has Windows PowerShell CMD, it's got PowerShell Core, PowerShell 7. You can kind of choose what you want to launch with the Windows terminal. So I'd use that as your kind of real-time command line interface is what I would say, and all your development work to go into VS Code. I think, this is another important point. I don't think you necessarily need to go back and change all your code that you've written previously. I think for me, I would draw a line in the sand and kind of start working to ensure any new kind of code project or solution I'm building, I'm looking to kind of build that on PowerShell Core or PowerShell 7 and kind of make that transition over time. Again, I've called it out previously, but we have kind of, it's basically the compatibility issues that came with kind of PowerShell Core or 6.0 are kind of largely gone, and that's kind of been coming in 7.7 and 7.1. So 7.1 brought the compatibility of .NET 5, and 7.0 has that baked-in compatibility layer that creates the implicit remoting sessions to 5.1 in the background if needed. Now that I would say only works on Windows, but I'd imagine most people attending the session probably are Windows. If not, we're largely there is the important thing. I think the final thing that I would say is, is that you can always fall back to Windows PowerShell 5.1 if needed. They're side by side, so it doesn't really have a great impact if you need to fall back. But you've got to try to make that transition. You've got to try to make that jump, is what I would take away and get going with. So for me, I've been working in PowerShell Core, PowerShell 7 for maybe a year, I would say, give or take, and I feel like 7.1 is probably the tipping point for most people, or I would hope it is at least. Those are the key takeaways. Normally at this point, I would open it up to any questions. Unfortunately, I don't have anyone here, so I would just like to say thanks a lot for listening to me and taking the time. It's appreciated. I will be on hand during the session, so hopefully I can get to hear some of those questions then and there. Otherwise, again, a sincere thanks a lot for listening.